some type of a race war, then black folks will be there'll be a genocide. So the only option that we have at that point then is to say, okay, are there ways we could reach across and join forces with folks that might not necessarily agree with us 100% of the time, but they agree on the basic principles, which is, the militarization of the police. White folks are up in arms about that. The erasure of our freedoms, of our privacies. People on the right and quote unquote white people are up in arms about that. The fact that we keep getting taxed more and more while the very wealthy effectively escape with nothing to pay it then on April 15th. Again, these things, let's face 5 major points that everyone almost could come to a complete and 100% agreement on. Focus on those 5 points. And then after that, we'll see what happens when the change arrives. And by the way, conversations change people. I've told you in the past about the run-in that I had with a former KKK member in South Carolina who hated me from a distance. But once I actually sat down with him and shared a cigarette with him and shared my life story with him, he apologized. And he said, wow, I've never actually met a black person before. I hated you from a distance because black dude would date his sister when he was a teenager. And ever since then, he hated all black people until he talked to me. And I humanized what he hated in abstraction. So Boogaloo Boys, if there happens to be elements that are racist within their ranks, or Proud Boys, talk. There's nothing that changes people like a conversation. Nothing solidifies hatred like being lectured to and being called a white supremacist or yo, you have white privilege. These things are not meant to change. They're meant to keep the status quo baked in. So I advocate talking. It doesn't hurt anybody. And at that point, if we realize that, well, we cannot, we're on separate sides regardless, then we'll see where that leads us. But at least let's get rid of the snake that's choking us right now.
I mean, on a lot of these counts, I agree with you. Fundamentally, I think that, yeah, we should try to get past the artificial boundaries that are dividing us and try to reach some real deeper unity. And ideally, we do it in a way that actually constructively reforms the government. I don't think a violent revolution. I don't think that what comes on the other side of those ashes is some new glory. It's just ashes, and then you have to rebuild things by hand. And admittedly, for some people, that is a lot more appealing than the present. Admittedly, for a lot of folks, I get it. If you're in a situation where you don't have any choices economically, where your family's screwed, to put it both bluntly and mildly, then yeah, the system as it is right now it just seems evil. And so you're like, anything I can do to take this down. But I really do think that there's something you have to be thinking about. What is the actual outcome of this? Anyway, when it comes to down to the fundamental stuff on this, I think we completely agree. We can agree to disagree, and we can have future conversations, I suppose, about COVID and about the insurrection at the Capitol, whether federal agents or the government agents, just to put it broadly, were stimulating that stuff. I don't see evidence for that. Yet why people would think that. Anyway, we need to come back to these some other time. But when it comes down to it, I think we agree fundamentally that we need unity. Teddy, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shane, Jamarl. Always, I appreciate coming on the show. The conversation is always enlightening, and so I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely, same. For those listening, Teddy Fikre is co-founder and former editor of GuillonJournal.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Teodrose Fikre and find his column at the Guillon Journal. Again, that is GHION Journal.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break in about a minute with headlines and the last 2 hours of today's show.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. Here in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 1,792 new coronavirus deaths and 154,917 new cases were reported in the United States on January 25th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 172,321 cases per day, a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Tuesday morning, more than 25,332,400 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and 420,999 have died from it. Man, who's going to be that unlucky 421,000 person? The first known United States case of coronavirus variant from Brazil was confirmed on Monday. COVID-19 Brazil P1 was detected in a person from the Twin Cities area in Minnesota who recently traveled to Brazil. Now, I have to be honest at this point, with the number of cases in the United States, I would be shocked if the variances that are either in Brazil or the UK aren't already in the States. We may not have the level of testing. We may not have the level of testing that goes into the specific different strains of it for us to find it, but I would be shocked. Now, this is the case from the Brazil, and the catch is, these variants, the problem that we're having, or that we are going to have as a society, is that the mutations and the variances have basically allowed these things to be more infectious, and based on some of the research, higher propensity for death. And some of this is significant, like the amount, like 30% or more. And so this is kind of the concern. The moment that you allow this stuff to get uncontrolled, you allow all of these kind of varied mutations, and the mutations would happen regardless, but basically allowing it to be run rampant like this is basically up the probability of mutations forming. And in this case, apparently we have, unfortunately, several. And the question is whether or not the vaccine is going to be able to deal with them. So this is something that we're going to come to heads with coming up as they ramp up the vaccine and as we see whether or not the vaccine handles it. But I got to be honest, all hands should be on deck. Vitamin D, some of the other medications that they found that don't necessarily have too many deleterious side effects, but can cut down the transmission. At this point, all hands on deck. California lifted regional stay-home orders across the state on Monday in response to improving coronavirus conditions, returning the state to a system of county-by-county restrictions. The move opens the way for a return to limited restaurant dining, religious services, and other activities. Yesterday, the White House announced President Joe Biden will sign an executive order reinstating COVID-19 travel restrictions on non-U.S. travelers from Brazil, Ireland, the UK, and 26 other European countries that allow travel across open borders. While House Press Secretary Jen Psaki also confirmed that South Africa will be added to the restricted list because of concerns about a variant of the virus that has spread beyond that nation. Shane, what do you think about this? I mean, it seems like we're playing whack-a-mole, and it seems like we're losing this game of whack-a-mole. California basically says, okay, we're going to open up county by county, as if people don't drive across county lines. I mean, think about what we're saying for the moment. The, Schengen zone, or the Schengen zone. I can see the word in my head, but...
Schengen.
Right.
It says Schengen.
The Schengen zone. So basically, if you ever travel to Europe, what you'll notice is if you get off, let's say in Amsterdam, or if you get off in one of the other countries, you could basically take a train or drive to all of these different countries. Like all of these different countries are basically connected. So you don't have to keep continuously getting passport checks and all of this other stuff. You have unrestricted travel. Now, the question becomes, if you have unrestricted travel and you have areas that are hotspots for COVID, how do you maintain your integrity and how do you prevent this virus from spreading? Now, Biden has taken the step of basically saying, okay, we're going to deal with travel from these countries. Now, California is saying, okay, we're going to open up the county and it's going to be county by county. But if the rule applies, well, we're saying we don't like this idea of traveling all of these different places without having the checks, without making sure that the person isn't transporting it from one area of low transmission or for good outcomes into an area of bad outcome. We don't want that mix. And yet, that's what we're saying for California. Does it make sense? Like, California is basically playing whack-a-mole where they're saying, okay, our conditions improve, so we're going to open up county by county. But people have the capacity to drive across county lines and across state lines. So just because you have a state that may be doing well now doesn't necessarily mean that people wouldn't travel to that state, creating outbreaks and worse conditions. If we're saying that we're going to basically block travel from certain sites because of open travel, how is the same not true for California? Does it make sense? Like, it just seems kind of weird. If California is really having an issue where certain counties are being hit by COVID, how do you open up other counties when there's travel and, cross pollination in a sense, from the standpoint of the virus to other parts of California, or for that part, to other parts of America? Just because an area is not necessarily ravaged by COVID now doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get travel or touring, or for that matter, the virus just kind of moving into a particular direction. Does it make sense, Shane? Like, meaning, this may be too early for California. By the same token, I understand the economic push
I hear what
for
you're
it.
saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it may be a little too soon. But by the same token,
here's the thing.
they got to get the economy up and
We
running.
talked about this a bit earlier. But it would help with that in the long run potentially, but I think it's completely politically infeasible, and that's the problem with it. And maybe it's just a uniquely American thing. I don't think that's entirely true, but there's an element of it. But if you start to lock down borders between states, it's not just shutting down travel to and from other countries, but if you start to lock down borders between, say, California and Arizona, or California and Nevada, et cetera, that's a bridge too far for like a lot of folks. I would say for the majority of Americans, they'll be like, wait, what? What are you trying to do? We're worried about the tyrannical overreach of our government as a baseline in the United States. If you start trying to prevent people from traveling, not to other countries necessarily, which I think a lot of people can understand, but again, across state lines or between counties, I get what you're saying. But I just don't think it would politically work out. I don't think that there is a politician in Congress or on the periphery of political attention right now who could rally public support for that. It's not on the horizon anywhere. And I don't know that I'd want them to, because again, that'd be extreme. That would be introducing something. Yeah, it would be very extreme.
And I got to be honest, I'm unaware at a time when we kind of shut down our state borders, even though it might have happened. I guess I'm saying this: if we are making the point that Europe is unsafe because Europe basically has a zone where people can kind of go from country to country to country without checks and everything else, then how's that different than states and going from state to state to state? It just seems like both of these, it's like the United States of Europe by, technically, if not necessarily as an actual fact. And in the same way that's kind of the United States of Europe where these guys can travel all across, isn't that the same thing for the United States? I don't see the difference, that's all. It just seems like both of these scenarios are the same. And we're basically saying, hey, we don't like the fact that you guys can travel between your countries, missing the fact that they may not like the fact that we can travel between states. It's interesting, that's all. I'm just pointing out the similarities and the weirdness with it. Yesterday, the White House announced President Joe Biden would sign an executive order or executive action reinstating COVID-19 travel restrictions on non-U.S. travelers from Brazil, Ireland, and the United Kingdom and 26 other European countries that allow travel across open borders. I think we read that one. A Canadian casino mogul and his actress wife were accused of posing as motel workers in order to receive COVID-19 vaccines meant for Indigenous residents of a remote Yukon community. Rodney Baker, 55, and his wife allegedly chartered a private plane to Beaver Creek on January 21st to get doses of the Moderna shot. That's low. That's low. That's extremely low. You basically have people who were at the lowest end of the economic scale. And those people who were at the lowest end of the economic scale, 42% of the public making $18,000 a year before COVID. The people with the higher incomes were basically able to go into their enclaves and stay in their houses, where the people who weren't in that position basically had to continue to work and put their lives on the line. These are people who are working at some of the retail shops, some of the stores like 7-Eleven or some of the grocery stores. They continuously put themselves on the line for us. We turned around and called them heroes because we didn't necessarily want to give them any additional funds for putting their lives on the line. If nothing else, they deserve first dibs. They were the ones who were putting their lives on the line, every bit as much as doctors and nurses. I get that the doctors and nurses, the order of magnitude is higher, but I'm making the point that you had various elements of our society, oftentimes the people who are paid the least, the people who are working multiple jobs to make ends meet, those people became vital. And in the terms of those people being vital, I would say that at the very least, we should have some tacit agreement that the fact that they were vital, yes, they should get additional revenue, but also they should get this first dibs. It is low. It is extremely low that they can book a chartered private plane in the first place in order to basically get the dibs. Yeah, that just seems low. I mean, they're basically pretending to be motel workers in order to get a vaccine. What do you think, Shane? Am I wrong in regards to how horrible this is?
No, it's pretty ridiculous. Again, a casino mogul. So you're talking about frontline workers often don't make nearly as much money as other folks. An exception to that, of course, would be nurses and doctors who are working in the hospitals. They're genuinely pretty well compensated. But for a lot of frontline workers, including particularly people who work at a motel, that's not the most highly compensated career. So to be a rich person, frankly, and to impersonate one of them in order to get a COVID vaccine, to get a shot, it's ridiculous. And apparently the clinic found out that it didn't actually work. They tried to call them at their residence where they were supposed to be quarantining near where they'd flown up in the Yukon. And they found them at the airport trying to fly back down to Vancouver in British Columbia. So they came in, they got the shots, impersonating, and then they just tried to book it. And it's a casino mogul and his wife, an actress, who are doing this. Yeah, it's ridiculous, man.
That's horrible. That's so horrible. God, that's so horrible. Moderna's CEO, Stéphane Bancel, announced new data showing the company's vaccine remains effective in battling new coronavirus variants. Good. The study showed protective, quote-unquote, immune responses to both the variant first documented in the UK, B.1.1.7, and the variant seen in South Africa, B.1.3.5.1. Moderna also announced it was beginning to test an additional booster dose of its vaccine out of an abundance of caution to potentially strengthen the immune response against emerging strains. Bancel announced his opinion on the virus long term. Quote, I believe SARS-CoV-2 is going to stay with humans forever. We're going to have to boost adapted. We have to have boosts adapted to a virus like we have for flu. It's the same thing. We have both mRNA vaccines, basically modified mRNA vaccines or viruses, and we're going to have to live with it forever, unquote. That is not pleasant. The Senate voted Monday evening to confirm Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary with bipartisan support. The final breakdown of the vote was 84 yeas to 15 nays. Yellen is the first woman to lead the department in more than 230-year history. Wow. And this will be the last. Rumors are circulating that former First Daughter Ivanka Trump, who served as a senior advisor to President in the previous administration, might run for Senate in Florida 2022. Also, Laura Trump, the wife of Donald Trump's second son, Eric, is allegedly actively considering a run for Senate from North Carolina in 2022. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. That's interesting. We're going to see whether or not the Trump brands basically last. So this is going to be very interesting. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Tells you more.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are now in an open segment. That means you can call in if you'd like to. The number is 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. I'm excited for our next guest. We've got a guest coming up in about 15 minutes. We're talking with John Kiriakou, who is back at Sputnik. Looking forward to that conversation. That should be fun. He's a good guy. But we'll come back to that when it's time to come back to that. We've been focusing on COVID today, at least in the headlines. We've been talking about this stuff a bunch, and I don't really blame us because, it's a growing thing. Although having said that, I don't know if you've been noticing this too, Jamarl, and admittedly I mentioned this yesterday, so it might have stood out to you. It seems like the numbers, at least the numbers of new infections, have been starting to drop back down, where for a while they were growing pretty continuously. And then over the last week, I've noticed that the number of new infections has pretty much constantly been lower than it had been in the weeks before. So what is it? Today, it is 31% down from the average 2 weeks earlier. I believe yesterday it was 33% from the average 2 weeks earlier. Now, admittedly, we're still early in the week, so they might be, collating, sort of rounding up data there. That's often what happens on Mondays, but it's a Tuesday now. I don't know. We'll check back in tomorrow and see if it's still lower. If that's the case, that's undoubtedly a good thing. I just wonder why. I think we're still too early in the vaccination cycle for enough people to have immunity that the infections would drop down. But I don't know, man. Any take?
Well, yeah. I mean, it seems that way, that it's going down over the last few days. It does seem, though, that over the weekends that the number drops. Like, I don't know if this is a registering thing or what. And so, like you say, it's Tuesday now. Let's see what happens on Wednesday. And honestly, let's give it a week. I mean, over the course of a week, we can average it out to see if there's a substantial drop, like if there's a real drop over the course of time versus just 1 or 2 days. But that will be good if it does go down. I mean, we were at 44,000 people a day at one point. Like, that number is appalling. And that's 4,000 people a day while we were locked down, give or take. Not an entire lockdown, but this kind of back and forth, half in, half out lockdown where some people are doing it, some people are not. Most people are wearing masks, some people are not. And it's like 4,400 people in the context of that. Talk about a horrible outcome, a horrible situation where it's like the worst of both worlds. And so if this number is going down, Lord knows, I hope it is. So we'll see. I mean, like you said, we haven't had enough time for the vaccinations to saturate the country yet. And so if we're seeing a decline, this decline may just be, I don't know, more people might be taking it seriously. Maybe the bumps from the New Year's of the holidays are going down and inspiring, meaning the numbers were baked in and they're going down now. I don't know. It's hard to know. But I really do hope it is going down in the variants. And that's the other thing, the variants. Like, we were getting 4,000 people dying when new variants were starting that were more infectious and that were more capable of death or causing death. And so it's very, this is not a great scenario, but by the same token, hopefully this scenario is coming to a close sooner rather than later, because this has been a rough last year. But that's my thoughts on it. My thought is this stuff can't last forever. And at some point, we just have to hunker down. Keep in mind, I look at this from the standpoint of my own medical history. I've had situations where I've spent long amounts of time ill, or long amounts of time in the hospital, or long amounts of time where you weren't being allowed to eat, or you were getting various stuff because you can't necessarily process food, or you're in the hospital with infections that are superbugs, meaning immune to the typical antibiotics, and they would have like a new class. Been through all that. So for me, in my head, it becomes the issue of endurance. Endurance is far easier than dealing with something that feels like it goes on forever. Meaning if you can change something in your head from, I just need to last for a month, 2 months, 3 months, that becomes far easier than this will never end. This will never end is a road to depression. This will last for a few months is a road to endurance. There's a difference. It does help. So,
I believe you. You know what? Let's go to calls. We've got a couple of callers on the line. Let's go to Kevin from Canada. Kevin, what's going on, man?
Hey, Jamarl, you did it. You did it. Awesome. You actually did it. Thank you very much.
Kevin, I'm going to have to make that video better, though. That video was, it was too long, and I need to make it more concise. But each week, I'm going to be doing it. So maybe once,
Awesome.
Look, honestly, I either thought once a day, Kevin. The goal is just to create a momentum of showing support. And when you show support, at the point where you get numbers, you can start marshaling those numbers for get-ins. Like, one of the things that, there was a debate between Bree and Sam Cedar, the Sanders communication director. And even though, there weirdness in that debate for both sides, but there was something that she said that is 1,000% right, that the power of movement, or the power of us, meaning from the standpoint of policy, is the American public. If it gets dragged into the political space, it will be dragged, suffocated, a bag over its head, and it will be buried. Your power is out there. So if you could show it in numbers, and you could have those numbers where you could eventually start coming up with ideas, communication, debating in regards to a direction, that's the pathway to power, I think. So yeah, Kevin, I'm going to have to make it more concise, but yeah, it's a good idea.
Thank you very much for taking it on. But I've been sitting on this idea for over a year, and I do have a few more ideas on how to make it popular. If you'd like, and I can't do it in 5-minute chunks. I was wondering if you could have an interview with me online or offline to discuss it.
Potentially. I would have to talk to the team on that one. That's not a personal choice.
Usually, Kevin, I thank you for the idea. And Jamarl, folks still need to hear what you did. They haven't necessarily been following us, every single damn day, especially during those last segments when we're taking calls and Kevin's been calling in. But usually, Kevin, my recommendation here, not speaking for Jamarl, just reach out privately. If you're doing it publicly, it's putting a little bit of pressure. And I get you came up with the idea, but still. That's usually, I don't know. Don't want to be pedantic here. But Jamarl, real briefly, what did you do? What's he talking about here?
Kevin came up with an idea that basically is trying to put pressure on Congress. And the thought is to show support for Medicare for All. Now, Medicare for All clearly has support. And I don't believe for a moment that Pelosi or Schumer or Biden doesn't know that 88% of Democrats want it, or that 74% of the American public wanted it on Fox News on election night, or at the low end, 69% want it. We're in the middle of a pandemic. All of those things should go in line. But there's something to be said for showing political pressure, and that was Kevin's idea, to try to create this cacophony of noise where you create viral sensations continuously pushing the idea of Medicare for all. And personally, to me, the strength of the idea is not entirely just the push. The strength of the idea is gathering numbers for further and future action later on. Shane, you have to talk about a political structure under a political structure. Well, how do you do that unless people can come together under some idea, some plan? And when you think about things like the civil rights movement or women's rights, those things were very specific in what they were trying to accomplish. And all sorts of people, regardless of their political discretion, could come under that banner. Meaning, you might be a right winger, but you also may have somebody who needs healthcare. And so you could join in on that without the alienation of, let's say, a party per se. So Kevin's idea was basically to push the idea of Medicare for all, to create viral moments constantly, over and over and over again, to bring all of the people under the umbrella who represents and who pushes for that interest. I think it's a great idea. And like I said, the strength of the idea to me is bringing all of the people under one particular umbrella of saying, this is what we want to accomplish. And at that point, you have options. Like, you as an individual have no options. You as a group have options. And so that's basically what was done. A video was made asking people to tweet at Pelosi, Schumer, and Biden their support for Medicare for all. And I put a tweet on my own page at the very top of the page, and I'm asking people to say, Medicare for all now, hashtag Medicare for all now, in addition to the reason why they want it. I think in my case, I put 20 million people have been infected. The government is at fault. Yes, the government is responsible for the healthcare of the nation at the point where it allows a pandemic to decimate the population. So that's what I was basically asking. That was Kevin's plan, and I like the idea. And so each week I'm going to push this, and I need to make the video a little bit more concise. But yeah, Kevin, it's a good idea, man. So thank you.
Cool. Good to hear. You made it happen, man. That's awesome. We got more callers. I think we should go to them. Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on, Michael?
Yeah, hey guys. Just quickly, I heard that Biden's moving troops into northeastern Syria, and at the same time, Russia has announced today they're moving troops into northeastern Syria to fight ISIS. So the potential confrontation there. They've reinforced their troops, and they've sent more troops into northeastern Syria from Russia. And also, I was talking the other day about America returning to the Monroe Doctrine and focusing on Venezuela as that potentially being the first new war under Biden. And I think Marco Rubio was talking in the Senate the other day about basically recognizing Juan Guaido and all the rest of the stuff, and basically running around promoting war against Venezuela. And also, you're talking about the dropping COVID numbers. Jimmy Lord did a good video on it today. Basically, ever since Biden's taken office, the whole messaging around COVID from the mainstream media has changed, and it's not really as big a problem as we thought. It's getting better. People are opening back up again. The whole country's opening back up again. And Jimmy Lord did a really good piece on the reduction in the reporting of COVID numbers on his page today.
We'll go check that out. Yeah, I haven't seen that video yet. I'll check that out. Thanks for the recommendation there, Michael. Yeah, as we were talking about earlier, the numbers appear to be dropping. I was kind of wondering if this had something to, I don't want to assume something. And it would be admittedly conspiratorial if I assume that suddenly now that Biden is in office, that, the COVID numbers are dropping. Some people were predicting that. But again, I don't know. I'm not on the front lines. We are most of the way through cold and flu season at this point. So there just could be some natural drop down there. And then we've had a steeper lockdowns, harsher lockdowns over the past month. So maybe that had something to do with it too. But the messaging, I don't think you can deny that. I don't know. We'll have to come back on that. We're running out of time for this segment, but thank you for the call, Michael. We're going into a break. We'll be back on the other side of this break with our guest, John Kiriakou. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are now joined by our next guest, John Kiriakou, who's a former CIA officer, the new co-host of The Backstory and author of books, including the CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. John, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
My pleasure. Good morning, guys. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, and better for having you with us. Let's talk about this new show and bringing you back. First of all, welcome back. Really great to have you on.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine.
Yeah, I would say the pleasure's all ours, but I don't want to get into a tug of war contest here. What's your focus here? Coming back onto the platform, coming back onto the show. What stories do you hope to focus on? What do you want to bring to light? What are you sort of looking at from your vantage? What do you think is important, John?
I should say that the backstory is very different from the last show that I did on Sputnik with Brian Becker. It was the last show was much more newsy, much more structured, and this one, the backstory with your dad, Lee Stranahan, is much more informal, friendly. It's more of a conversation. You know, somebody said to me the other day that it's like hanging out with a couple of friends and having a beer. And really that's what it feels like to me. It's very informal, a lot of fun.
So speaking out it as very informal and a lot of fun, I got to be honest, I am happy that you're back too. I've always enjoyed listening, or for that matter, having conversations with you. So absolutely welcome back. Like Shane said, we're not going to get into it. Who cares about it more? So let me ask you this: the stuff that has been taking place from the standpoint of all of the stuff, the insurrections. And by the way, I was listening to a video that you did about the last days of Trump in the White House. This is a fascinating story that you have to tell and explain to the public. I did a video recently talking about how weird the last days were, that Trump is basically going through the White House like a ghost, that everybody's trying to avoid him because he's angry. Yeah. Twitter has basically lost privilege. He's trying to get Mike Pence to overturn the election. He's trying to get all of these people to basically overturn the election. But there's something else to that. Donald Trump was working with Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell. And these guys were coming up with the idea that the communists was working with the CIA, which were working with Brian Kemp, with the blessings of the Chinese, in order to overturn the election. Like, all of this stuff was just out there. But on top of that, there was something that was said that I think they said it was like charged $50,000 a day for defense. And we saw like all of these weird, bizarre pardons. None for Snowden, none for Assange, and none for you. Now, explain where you come in
exactly right.
on this story about the idea of pardons and everything else and the bizarreness of the pardon scenario, especially from the standpoint of pardons potentially being sold from the White House.
Yeah, this has become kind of a big story. You know, I was convicted in 2012 of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. I was charged after blowing the whistle on the CIA's torture program. And so I have tried literally every day of my life since then to secure a presidential pardon. I failed under Barack Obama, although I came close. I got all the way up to a meeting with Joe Biden, and Biden, to his credit, went to the mat for me. But I failed. And so once Donald Trump became president, I thought, well, I don't have a shot now. But then the same people who went after me began going after Trump. For example, Robert Mueller had set up the John Kiriakou task force at the FBI. John Brennan is the one that demanded that charges be filed against me. Peter Strzok is the one who put the cuffs on me and arrested me that day in 2012. So through my attorney, I hired a lobbyist, a woman who had worked with the Trump campaign. She had been the campaign manager of the Trump campaign in Florida in 2016. And she said that for $50,000, she could get me a pardon. And once I got that pardon, I would pay her a second $50,000. That turned out to be wishful thinking. Rudy Giuliani, on the other hand, and Corey Lewandowski and a handful of other people close to Donald Trump were asking upwards of $1 million. In Giuliani's case, $2 million. Well, I had occasion to meet with Giuliani in July. It was July 1st of last year at the Trump Hotel, and it was about an unrelated issue. It was an issue related to a sale of N95 masks to the Pentagon. And during a break in the conversation, I thought, well, what the heck? I'm gonna take a shot. And I mentioned the notion of a pardon and approaching the president for a pardon. I said, I have some high-level Republican support. I've got Rand Paul. I've got Alan Dershowitz. I have Tucker Carlson. There's a Republican congressman from Florida who's been great. And Giuliani stood up and said, I've got to hit the head. He had to use the men's room. So he walked away. And his assistant, who had been at the table, not assistant, his partner who had been at the table, said to me, Rudy never talks pardons. You have to talk to me. I said, okay. And he says, but Rudy's going to want $2 million. And I laughed and I said, $2 million? I said, first of all, I don't have $2 million. Secondly, why would I spend $2 million to recover a $700,000 pension? Forget it. And we blew it off. But I thought, you know what? If I ever tell this story, people aren't going to believe me. So I asked Giuliani if we could take a picture together. And he gladly stood up, you know, with his drink in his hand, and we all put our arms around each other's shoulders, and I got a picture with Giuliani. Next thing you know, the New York Times calls me. Mike Schmidt, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, says that he's been hearing that Giuliani is offering himself up to broker pardons for $2 million. I said, well, yeah, that's true, actually. Mike Schmidt, it turned out, Jamarl talked to 30 people, 30 different people who had contact with Giuliani on the issue of pardons. And that's what this New York Times article was about a couple of Sundays ago. But this is sort of the dirty little secret. You know, this is not the way pardons are supposed to be done. The way you're supposed to apply for a pardon is you go online to the Office of the U.S. Pardon Attorney, you fill out the form goes to the FBI, they do a background investigation to see if you are really reformed and rehabilitated and you've remade your life, etc. And then they make a recommendation to the Office of the Pardon Attorney, and then the Pardon Attorney makes a recommendation to the White House. That's not how it worked with the Trump administration. The way it worked with the Trump administration is if you were a friend of the president or an associate of the president or a crooked politician, because you see how many crooked politicians got pardons in the last day of the Trump administration, or if you have an other in, and I mean specifically Kanye West, Kim Kardashian, you have a way to get to the president directly, you're going to get a pardon. And that's exactly what we saw happen.
And that, in part, at least, explains the wave of pardons. That what was it? Approximately 140 pardons that he released in his last couple of days of the presidency. So, how would you characterize this? Is this? I'll be honest. I don't mean to state this as an actual thing, but it reminds me of an extortion racket. It reminds me of this idea of you're facing a crime, and then it's sort of pay to play system. And again, I'm not leveling that as an actual crime. It just sort of reminds me of it. Does that characterization fit for you, John? How do you see this?
Yes, it does. It is pay for play. It's not illegal, which is kind of the oddity about this whole thing. It's certainly unethical, but it's not illegal. So what you're doing when you fork over this money, you're not buying a pardon. You're engaging a lobbyist, and that's how they keep it legal. And you know, I can't entirely blame Donald Trump for this. I blame the pardon attorney, because the pardon attorney is supposed to be recommending people to be pardoned. And you get 10,000 applications like they did in the last year of the Obama administration, and they make a positive recommendation for 6. Well, that's not the way the system is supposed to work. In addition, when Congress created the Office of the U.S. Pardon Attorney, they meant for it to be housed at the White House. This is supposed to be a White House advisor, somebody to advise the White House counsel on recommendations. But it's not housed at the White House. It's housed at the Justice Department. So instead of being independent, it's very much dependent on the prosecutors at the Justice Department to help them make a recommendation. And no prosecutor is going to want to pardon a case that he prosecuted.
That makes sense, because from their standpoint, they look at it as a person is guilty. We don't want to give this person a break, et cetera, et cetera. Wow, that is horrendous. I mean, they're basically, there's in DC, if you're going to, there's like, marijuana is illegal in DC, but it is not illegal to own. And so you get these kind of weird phenomena where a person would go to like a pop-up. They would say, here is $50 for this lollipop, but you can have the pot for free. Meaning it's an end round. It's a way of skirting a particular law in order to get something accomplished. So after they offered the $2 million and you took the picture with Giuliani, what happened after that? Did you just leave? They're basically holding out, saying, hey, you can get this for $2 million. And it's very clear. You know that's what they're doing, even if it's like, this kind of wink and a nod where Giuliani says, I have to hit the head. And then all of a sudden, the real negotiation takes place. So what happens after that? That is amazing.
The rest of the story is going to make you shake your head. But I'll give you a little bit of background so you understand the details. So I have a friend who's quite wealthy. And when COVID hit, he ordered 500 million masks from a Chinese manufacturer. And he called me and he said, hey, you want to make a lot of money? Help me sell these masks. I'll give you 10 cents a mask. I said, great. So he called me a couple of months later and he said, I think I sold 150 million masks to the Pentagon, but there's something stuck in procurement and I need help getting it unstuck. They signed the contract, but they haven't cut the check. I said, okay, well, what do you want me to do? He said, well, I think we need to get Rudy Giuliani to call the Secretary of Defense. Do you know Giuliani? I said, no, I don't know Giuliani, but I think I can get to him because I know Bernie Kerik. Kerik was the New York police commissioner under Giuliani, and Kerik got himself in some trouble and ended up going to prison for 3.5 years. So when he got out of prison and I got out of prison, we connected and we gave a speech together at a local university. So I called Bernie Kerik. And Bernie said that, he can put me in touch with Rudy, but he's going to want a little taste. I said, yeah, there's plenty of money to go around for everybody if we get this deal done. So he puts me in touch with Giuliani through a partner of Giuliani's. And I told him what we wanted. We just wanted him to go with us to this meeting with the Secretary of Defense. And the guy said, well, he'll want $1 million for the meeting. And I said, great, there's going to be plenty of money. So we went to the Trump Hotel and we were meeting and we had decided all together that we would go to the office of the Secretary of Defense the next day. So the pardon conversation was just 5 minutes of that meeting. The next day, we all get together and we go to the Pentagon. As we're walking up the steps to enter the Pentagon, Giuliani stops and he says, I don't want $1 million. I want $2 million. And my buddy says, no, wait a minute, we have a deal for $1 million. And he said, yeah, I'm not going to do the meeting unless I get $2 million. I want $2 million. And my friend said, forget it. And Rudy walked back and sat in the car. And we never sold those masks.
Serious? That is astonishing.
Let me tell you one more thing about Rudy, too. The New York Times, about 6 months ago, did an article about his divorce. This is Rudy Giuliani's 4th divorce. And in the course of discovery, the Times learned that Giuliani, get this, is a member of 16 country clubs. And he told the judge that he needs $7 million a year to maintain his current lifestyle. And I saw it. He gouges, or at least he tries to gouge, everybody he encounters, whether it's John Kiriakou or Donald Trump or everybody in between, because he needs $7 million to pay the dues on his 16 country clubs.
John, that is astonishing. That is astonishing. I mean, like corruption, moral, malfeasance, ethical violations.
But you know what, though, Jamarl? The sad truth is that that's Washington.
Yeah.
That's how Washington works. Like I said a minute ago, it's not illegal. It's certainly unethical, but that's just the way Washington works. It's disgusting.
And it seems like they put these provisions in for the explicit point of being able to access these things later.
Yes, so they can all get rich.
The voice you guys are listening to is former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, author of the books The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. You guys are listening to Fault Lines on Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are still thankfully joined by our guest, John Kiriako. He's a former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. John, thank you again for being with us. I want to change topics slightly. Fascinating story from last segment, and again, just strikingly immoral behavior from Giuliani there. But like you said, I think that's indicative of how Washington works. But let's talk about the CIA for a minute. What do you think? We could talk a lot about what's happened over the past month. And I do want to come back to some of this as well. Let's talk about Syria, recent movement there, if we have time for it. But first of all, what do you think of William Burns as Biden's pick to head the CIA?
I was very pleasantly surprised when Bill Burns was chosen to head the CIA. Shocked, really, for a couple of reasons. One, I've known Bill Burns not terribly well, but I've known him for the last, 31 years. And the guy has ably served presidents of both parties. There's not a political bone in his body. He's been ambassador to Russia. He's been ambassador to Jordan. He's had every high-level job at the State Department you could have: assistant secretary, deputy secretary, undersecretary. He's done everything. But what made me happiest was the fact that he spent much of his career promoting peace, specifically the Arab-Israeli peace process. So this is a guy who values human rights. He values diplomacy and negotiation. This was really an inspired choice, especially, after having Bloody Gina Haspel and John Brennan and Mike Morrell in the office of Central Intelligence Director before him. So this is a guy who can institute reforms and still command respect. I was very, very happy. There was a great article in today's New York Times, not an article, but an op-ed, saying that that so far Joe Biden has balanced hawks and doves in his foreign policy. I would prefer to have seen far more doves, but Bill Burns was solidly on the dove side.
Very interesting. And so from if people are policy, I always make this argument that people are policy. What does this pick means? Like, what does it mean? Like because for example, Al Blinken, warhawk, and over the course of the decades, he's very clear from the side of warhawks. Yeah. You have various people from multiple industries and everything else that seem to have that has cross purposes with, let's say, what the American public may want its country to do from a standpoint of military. And yet you have a pick like this. So if people are policy, what does this pick say about Biden and his plans from the standpoint of foreign policy? I mean, is this kind of just a mismatch?
No, I don't think so, because the CIA is not a policy agency. It's a process agency. It's a support agency. So by law, the CIA is not allowed to make policy. It has to support the policy of the president. That's a bad thing in this case. Normally, I would say that's not just a good thing, but a very, very good thing, because you don't want the CIA involved in policy. But you may want this CIA director involved in policy, because he has spent the last 32 years working in or more than that, 40 years working in policy. I think the specific reason why he was named CIA director is to reform the organization. No more secret prisons, no more torture programs, no more international kidnappings. They have to get away from that. The purpose of the CIA should be to recruit spies to steal secrets and then to analyze those secrets so that the policymaker can make the best informed policy. And they've gotten very, very far away from that. You had John Brennan, for example, maintaining a kill list. You had John Brennan breaking into the Senate Intelligence Committee's computer systems and then not being punished for it. You've got to get away from all that stuff, and you've got to just support the president's ability to formulate his policies.
Do you think it's possible to get away from that stuff? I mean, the CIA, when it switched over from the OSS, they were the president's men. Like, it was understood that they were the president's guy. Their job was to go out there and do the illegal stuff that the president couldn't necessarily do. Meaning, initially, it was they're just working on the best interests of America, whatever that is, that in their heads anyway. And the president
in their heads.
But didn't want to know what they were doing. He just kind of assumed that they were doing the best interests because the president doesn't want to get caught knowing illegal behavior, which was the entire point of them tying the CIA to the president, meaning somebody has to give an order. And even then, it was still somewhat messy in regards to trying to figure out who was giving commands for them to do X or to Y. So they were always the president's men in this case. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is it possible to change the behavior and the characteristics of that particular organization when it was already in the bricks?
I hate to say it, but I think no. I think it's not possible to change the organization. And I think the reason that it's not able to change is 9/11. After the Church Commission in 1975, when the CIA was emasculated, rightfully so, because of what it was doing around the world. It was spying on Americans. It was experimenting with drugs. It was overthrowing governments and assassinating world leaders. That all had to change. It was all illegal, not just a violation of international law, but that was a violation of U.S. law. And so that actually did change in 1975. And that change remained in effect until September 11th. And then they went back to the bad old days, but in a far more sophisticated way. So after 9/11, we saw an unrestrained CIA. We saw a CIA working more in the shadows than it ever had before and getting away with it. Because even on the oversight committees, no one was willing to stand up and say, this is wrong. We're not going to do this. Nobody, except maybe Ron Wyden. I actually challenged Ron Wyden, the senior senator from Oregon. I challenged him one time, and he abruptly interrupted me and said, look, it takes all my energy just to not lose my security clearance, okay? And that really, encapsulated it for me.
Interesting. What does he mean by that? It takes all of his energy not to use the security clearance. So he's concerned that if he pushes, that he's basically going to be either removed or his ability to push further is going to be removed.
Exactly right.
But
exactly
that
right.
That destroys all notion of oversight.
Oversight used to be real oversight. It used to be legitimate oversight. Where I'll give you an example. When I was stationed in Greece, we had a source that we had recruited, and he did something terrible, something that was going to end our relationship. And so I went back to my chief and I said, hey, the source did something terrible last night. And I explained what it was. And he says, all right, we've got to do a congressional notification right away. And so I did. And I sent a cable to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and I was ordered to cut the source off immediately. And that's what I did. Well, that would never happen today. I mean, that was a year before 9/11, a year and a half before 9/11. That would never happen post 9/11, because when you wrestle with pigs, you're going to get dirty. That's just the nature of intelligence.
But what about Abrams? I mean, Abrams, when he was working under the Reagan administration, I believe it was the Reagan administration, that basically kill squads. I mean, and he would even give
without
updates,
a doubt.
Yeah, in regards to what was taking place and what he was doing. And they were still okay with him doing that. Yes, he gets convicted at a certain point and then he gets pardoned. But I guess I'm saying, is it really was it really, was 9/11 that dramatic of a difference in regards to the tenor of the organization? Like, it really was a flashpoint. I mean, it really was this kind of singularity in regards to the change that happened within the organization itself.
Well, during the Reagan administration, you're talking specifically about Latin America, which was really a black eye for the U.S. government and for the CIA. What they were doing then was going through proxies, going through these right-wing death squads and crooked governments, so as not to do it themselves. But I'll give you an experience from the Clinton administration. When I was at the CIA, we were informed just after Bill Clinton took office that we were going to engage in something called a cull, C-U-L-L, where we were going to go through literally every file of every recruited asset. And if they had any human rights problems in their pasts, they were going to be fired, and we weren't going to do business with them anymore. And the CIA got rid of fully 1/3 of their recruited assets. Did that hurt intelligence collection? Of course it did. But, you know, you've got to be on the side of the angels sometimes. You got to do the right things sometimes. And Bill Clinton, to his credit, at least tried to do that. I didn't believe it when it was first announced. I thought it was a PR stunt. And then sure enough, they got rid of 1/3 of their sources. And I thought, well, Bill Clinton is serious about human rights, but George W. Bush certainly wasn't. Dick Cheney certainly wasn't.
So, John, if Burns tries to clear out the CIA, what roadblocks is he going to face? First of all, do you think that he will be able to succeed at this? What would it take to succeed at this? If it's a success, it wouldn't be, blowing it up and building it back up from the bottom. It would be reforms of various kinds. What would those look like? And sort of what measures would you use looking at this from the outside to estimate how well he's doing?
This is where he has to be very, very careful, because Jimmy Carter tried this in 1977 with the appointment of Admiral Stansfield Turner as the director of Central Intelligence. And Turner's idea was indeed to just blow the place up and build it back from the ground. What he ended up doing was firing about 1/4 of the CIA's operations officers. Many of them were just months away from qualifying for their pensions. It was called Bloody Friday or Black Friday. That's what it was, Black Friday. And they never forgave Stan Turner for that. Never forgave him. In fact, he came back for a briefing one time when I was there, and I was asked to brief him, and I was told to brief him at the unclassified level. And I said, why? Former directors get secret briefings. Not Turner, I was told. Turner's the enemy of the CIA. So they did as little work for Turner as they possibly could. Burns has to avoid that kind of fallout. So if he's going to reform, he has to do it slowly, and he has to do it deliberately, not necessarily fire people, right? Because your problem, I think, is not in the workforce. It's in the direction that you're giving the workforce. It's in policy, not in personnel. And so you have to get away from breaking the law. You have to get away from violating rights.
We've only got a couple of seconds left, but just to follow up on that, is there an atmosphere in the CIA, as far as you can tell, of people who are concerned about the violations of human rights? If so, how prevalent is that, John?
Yes. Even when I was there were people who were resigning because of the torture program, people who were curtailing their positions and coming back to headquarters because of the torture program. So there are people there who want to respect human rights. It's the leadership that needs to be reined in.
You know what? We're out of time, but fascinating conversation, great insights, and thank you so much for joining us, John.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For those listening, that was the voice of John Kiriako. He's a former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including the CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. And you can follow him on Twitter at John Kiriakou and learn more about him at his website, johnkiriakou.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute with our headline segment.
Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live for our last hour this morning, you're listening to the most disruptive show in American and global news, politics, and events. In the Independent Corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into the headlines first thing here, at least 1,792 new coronavirus deaths and 154,917 new cases of COVID were reported in the U.S. yesterday, January 25th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 172,321 cases per day. That's a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier, but still objectively high numbers if you look at the overall scheme of things. You know, lower than a couple of weeks ago, but if you compare that to a couple of months ago, it's still bad. As of Tuesday morning, more than 25,332,400 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and just about 421,000 people have died from it. The first known U.S. case of a coronavirus variant from Brazil was confirmed on Monday. COVID-19 Brazil P1, that's the name of the variant, was detected in a person from the Twin Cities area in Minnesota who recently traveled to Brazil. Over in California, they're lifting regional stay-at-home orders across the state in response to improving coronavirus conditions, returning the state to a system of county-by-county restrictions. The move opens the way for a return to limited restaurant dining, religious service, and other more social activities. Yesterday, the White House announced President Joe Biden will sign an executive action reinstating COVID-19 travel restrictions on non-U.S. travelers from Brazil, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and 26 other European countries that allow travel across open borders. We were talking about the Schengen system earlier. That's what they're talking about here. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki also confirmed that South Africa would be added to the restricted list because of concerns about a variant of the virus that has spread beyond that nation. We'll be coming back to that in just a minute, by the way. A Canadian casino mogul and his actress wife were accused of posing as motel workers in order to receive COVID-19 vaccines meant for Indigenous residents of a remote Yukon community. Rodney Baker, 55, and his wife, an actress, allegedly chartered a private plane up to Beaver Creek, that's in the Yukon, on January 21st to get doses of the Moderna shot. And then when authorities at the clinic, staff tried to call them at their sort of chosen quarantine location, they weren't there. They found out that at that time, the couple were at the airport trying to fly back down to Vancouver in British Columbia. Just ridiculous. We were talking about this earlier. We've got a bunch more headlines, so I won't linger, but that's obscene. Moderna's CEO, Stéphane Bancel, announced new data showing his company's vaccine remains effective in battling new coronavirus variants. That's good news. I'll just put it like that. The study showed, quote-unquote, protective immune responses to both the variant first documented in the UK, that's B117, and the variant seen in South Africa, that's B1351. Moderna also announced it was beginning a test of an additional booster dose of its vaccine out of an abundance of caution to potentially strengthen the immune response against emerging strains. I guess the idea here is, you give them more, that provokes more immune response. And then even if you have some variations on the code that you have to be responding to in these new strains, well, they've got more to go with there, so to speak. Bancel added his opinion on the virus. In the long term, he said, quote, I believe SARS-CoV-2 is going to stay with humans forever. We're going to have boosts adapted to a virus like we have for flu. It's the same thing. They're both mRNA viruses, and we're going to have to live with it forever, quote unquote. I'll put it like this. That's not a phrase that anybody wants to hear right now. I think the vast majority of folks, unless you're like a lifelong introvert who's really enjoying the break from the public, and you don't like working at home and you don't care about the death everywhere, unless you're that person, you're not enjoying this situation. So hearing that you're going to have to live with it forever doesn't sound too good. Although I think what he's saying is not, lockdowns forever. It's that this is a disease that's going to stick with us. In fact, that is definitely what he's saying. And hopefully we break this thing this year. We'll see about that. The Senate, in national political news, voted on Monday evening, that's last night, to confirm Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary with bipartisan support. The final breakdown of the vote was 84 yeas to 15 nays. She is the first woman to lead the department in its more than 230-year history. And again, Just a tiniest bit of background for Yellen. She was previously the United States, the 15th chair of the Federal Reserve under Obama's second term and Trump's term from 2014 to 2018. So that's kind of her background. I want to do, at some point, we should do some sort of dedicated segment on her and her policies, what she did when she was chair of the Fed, coming off of Bernanke, and what we can expect her to do as the new Secretary of the Treasury. That'll be, we got evidence to go on. In other words, there's ample material to understand where her mindset is and what kinds of policies she would propose, how she would respond to different threats to the economy, that kind of thing. I don't know all that much about it, so we should bring somebody on to talk about it. In our next headline, rumors are circulating that the former first daughter of Ivanka Trump, who served as a senior advisor to the president in the previous administration, might be running for the Senate in Florida in 2022. Also, Lara Trump, it's the wife of Donald Trump's second son, Eric, is allegedly actively considering a run for the Senate from North Carolina in 2022. So in these upcoming midterms, we will see a resurgence of the Trumps. We'll see how well they do, though. Last evening, on Monday evening, the article of impeachment was delivered to the Senate floor, formally triggering Donald Trump's second impeachment trial in the Senate. It would take 67 senators to convict Trump in the upper house. Chief Justice John Roberts, who presided during Trump's first impeachment, will not be doing so this time, making way for Senator Patrick Leahy, as the U.S. Constitution says that a Chief Justice must preside when an incumbent president is being impeached, which Trump is no longer. Again, not the incumbent president. The trial there in the Senate will be beginning in a little under 2 weeks, so 2 Mondays from now. In international news, Estonia's new two-party coalition government has been sworn in with the first female prime minister in the Baltic country since it regained independence in 1991. The 15-member cabinet of Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, a 43-year-old lawyer and a former European Parliament lawmaker, was approved Tuesday in the 101-seat Kiriakou legislature after Estonia's president, also a first woman electee, had first appointed it. Today is Republic Day in India. The Delhi police had earlier given permission to protesting farmers to carry out their proposed tractor rally against new farm reforms by the Narendra Modi government. The Indian farmer rallies have allegedly turned violent, with protesters and police filmed clashing and officers reportedly using tear gas. Police used their batons to disperse the rallies, while some protesters were spotted wielding swords. Clashes in the capital and in other cities across the country erupted as Indians were celebrating the holiday, marking the 72nd anniversary of the day the Constitution of India came into effect. In Italy, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte will announce his will to resign today amid a political crisis in the country. The resignation is expected to be a technical step in order to try to form a new government afterwards with a bigger parliamentary support. Last week, Conte won the backing of the Senate in the confidence vote with a slim margin. He received a simple majority of votes, which is what the Constitution technically requires, but failed to secure an absolute majority of 161 senators, which makes it difficult for him to actually govern and bring through the parliament certain legislative acts. During a meeting with the Russian foreign minister and his Iranian counterpart, Javad Zarif, both parties agreed Moscow and Tehran are both interested in the complete restoration of the Iran nuclear deal, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That's the JCPOA for short. The Russian foreign minister stressed that due to both Moscow and Tehran's role in the region, the two states are also interested in expanding a dialogue on a number of other issues, such as security in the Persian Gulf, the resolution of the domestic conflict in Afghanistan, and the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Ecuadorian National Court has sentenced former Vice President Jorge Glass to 8 years of imprisonment for irregularities and contracting of the Ecuadorian Singüe oil field. In addition, 4 other people were jailed for 8 years in the same case. The European Union has announced that despite regarding Juan Guaido as a quote-unquote privileged interlocutor, it no longer considers him an interim president of Venezuela. 27 members of the bloc said in a joint statement that Guaido is a part of the democratic opposition, despite a recent European Parliament's resolution for EU governments to maintain Guaido's position as head of state. It's a little bit too little too late, and I wanted to go through pretty much most of the headlines before we talked about this one. But Jamarl, it's good thing, I'll put it like this, he hasn't been president ever, effectively. What's your take on this move by the EU?
I mean, Donald Trump basically said he was president of the United States, and Democrats said he wasn't. They didn't like the fact he was pretending to be president of the United States after losing an election. And yet, Joe Biden would turn around and say, Juan Guaido, despite never being elected, not, running at a competition, is supposedly president of Venezuela. The EU, at the very least, pulls back a little bit on this and says, okay, this guy's opposition. But let's be clear, he was never president of anything. It was always, he was basically a traitor. I mean, like in real terms, he tried to have a mass military uprising. And he didn't care how many of the Venezuelans would get killed or hurt in that uprising. I mean, the contract that these guys were working on basically had them take military bases and killing whoever they needed to kill or capture in order to take the government. So he, if he was in any other country, he would be hung as a traitor. And it just so happened that because he is this kind of opposition figure, that he's untouchable in this sense. Well, untouchable or touchable, depending upon the perspective. And the perspective can be made that Juan Guaido should be looking over his back, because if they need to create an impetus to go into Venezuela or the impetus to push back against Venezuela, him not being there and blaming Maduro on it would be a way to potentially do it. But all things being equal, yeah, Juan Guaido didn't get elected to a pie shop. And yet they're still pushing this idea that this guy, who most of the public doesn't even know, like talking about, is leader. Opposition, fair enough, but don't call him president.
I hear you on that one. You're talking about a false flag there, not freedom fries.
Your voice became deep, Jamarl.
Flag. Anyway, back to headlines here. Mike Lindell, the CEO of MyPillow and supporter of ex-U.S. President Donald Trump, was suspended by Twitter yesterday. The suspension comes after Lindell said he is mulling a possible run for governor of Minnesota in 2022. However, he stressed that it doesn't make sense if it won't be done via paper, tweeting, quote, "Why would anybody want to run if they had the same machines with that election fraud," end quote. Previously, he had urged Trump to impose martial law, that's a quote, in 7 states and challenge the election result, accusing voting machine companies Smartmatic and Dominion voting systems of conspiracy to alter the results of the 2020 election. At this point, I need to pause for a second. It's not a laughing matter. At this point, earlier in the year, you had, many Republicans calling for, early last year, pardon me, many Republicans calling for the imposition of martial law in response to the Black Lives Matter protests. Then you have Mike Lindell from MyPillow, again, also calling for martial law. And he wasn't the only one. I heard, other, not necessarily high-ranking Republicans, but high-ranking Trumpians calling for the imposition of martial law. And then you had the actual declaration and imposition of what was de facto martial law during the inauguration, with over 20,000 National Guardsmen, Guardswomen in the Capitol, razor wire strung up along the perimeter, and less than about 1,000 actual attendees. So again, a ratio of 25-1 of guards to attendees of the event. Not good times. Both parties, wanted it. In different cases, we're at that point in our country. Anyway, in our next headline, Twitter is asking its users for help in combating fake news. It has announced a pilot that allows people to submit notes on tweets that may be false or misleading. That initiative is named Birdwatch. It's being trialed among a small group in the U.S. initially. The firm acknowledged that the new system would have to be, quote, resistant to manipulation attempts. Good luck with that. The pilot will allow users to flag tweets they believe to be misleading or false, provide evidence to the contrary, and discuss them with each other on a separate Birdwatch site. Additional notes and flags would then be placed on content. Twitter says this new approach could help it respond more quickly when misleading information spreads. We should have a segment on this at some point soon. In business news, the CIA of Apollo Global Management, Leon Black, announced on Monday that he will resign from his position after the hedge fund conducted an internal investigation into the relationship between Black and the late American financier and convicted sex offender, Jeffrey Epstein. Apollo stated that it is releasing the report made by the Deschert LLP legal firm regarding the Black-Epstein relationship, providing some key takeaways. In particular, the statement highlighted that the report found no evidence of Black participating in Epstein's criminal activities, while admitting that Epstein, quote-unquote, regularly advised Black on, quote, trust and estate planning, tax issues, philanthropic endeavors, and the operation of his family office, end quote. And our last headline here, emotional support animals are no longer free to roam about the cabin on Southwest Airlines. The airline said Monday that it will let passengers bring trained service dogs in the cabin, but it will no longer accept support animals starting March 1st. Customers who want to bring a dog or cat on board as a pet will have to pay a fee, and the animal must be kept in a carrier that fits under an airplane seat. The move follows the Transportation Department decision to reverse a years-long regulation and let airlines ban animals that owners claim provide emotional support. Airlines said some passengers abused the old rules to avoid pet fees. You can very well see that happening. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are now going into a break. We will be back shortly with our next guest, Ben Swann, talking about domestic terrorism, Patriot Act 2.0, and more. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Yo! So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. But joining us is multi-award-winning investigative journalist, chief executive officer of ISE Media Network, a free speech network dedicated to creating an uncensored, blockchain-based, decentralized news and entertainment platform with a funding mechanism for independent media. Ben Swann. Ben, welcome to the show.
Your voice is still deep.
Okay, so let's do this. I'm having a bit of a technical issue, so I'm going to let Shane take over. Go for it, Shane.
Yeah, Ben, thank you. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Let's have a conversation about domestic terrorism, quote unquote. What I've heard a couple of people call now Patriot Act 2.0, which instead of being a single act would be a sort of wave of responses to recent events. But I think the most natural starting point would probably be the events to which they're responding, namely a couple of weeks ago when many Trump supporters basically breached the Capitol building while a vote was going on over the Electoral College ballots. A sort of singular event, as far as I can tell, in American history. Let's just start there. Ben, what do you think about what went down there? What were you thinking while that was happening? What did you think in the 24 hours that followed that? What was your take on this, Ben?
Yeah, well, as you guys may or may not know, I was there on the Capitol grounds while it was happening, covering it live, and I was working with RT America at the time as this was going on, and so I'm there on the ground. We were at the Washington Memorial prior to that during President Trump's speech, and then the crowd moved down to the Capitol. We followed, what was happening. We got word that there was a breach happening, and went down there and stayed until 9 o'clock at night, watching all of this take place. And what I can tell you is that, certainly there were people who breached that Capitol who, intended to damage the building and get in there and do what? I'm not even sure. I don't even think many of them knew. I talked to so many people that day, guys, who were coming out of the building, who were waiting to go in, some who were on the Capitol grounds and cheering it on but had no interest in going in themselves. But what was so interesting to me was a couple of the people who came out afterwards, and what they said
I would ask them, so what were you hoping to accomplish by pushing your way into the building? And the guy, one of these guys says to me, listen, he says, you hear the term mob mentality. And he said, it's exactly, and he was shaking. Like the whole time we were talking, he was shaking because his nerves were so on edge and his adrenaline was so high. And he said, that's exactly what this was. He says, once I pushed in, I got stuck in there because there's a huge crowd behind you and there's a crowd in front of you and you just kind of start moving through the building. So they just kind of moved through the building until they got back out again. And he was one of the people who was in Nancy Pelosi's office. He said, we went through her office and walked through that area. And he had video showing me all this video on his phone of all these different rooms he was in. But the point was that so many of these people who did get into the building just kind of moved through the building. And what happened that day is terrible. It was illegal. It's not something that should be celebrated on any level. But to take that and say this is an act of terrorism, domestic terrorism, to me is bizarre. When we had the Fort Hood shooter who went on the Fort Hood Army post and opened fire, Nizal Hassan, and opened fire and began shooting members of the military. That was called a non-domestic terrorist incident by President Obama. He said this is not domestic terrorism. So what I'm trying to understand as a journalist is, so what is domestic terrorism? How is it defined? Because this, I've never heard of a domestic terrorist incident where the terrorists attempt to use signs, for the most part, to overthrow the government. That's what's being said. Well, they were trying to overthrow the government. There were a few people there who were definitely agitators. We saw a guy who had a case with him that two guys, they opened it up and they had little flashbangs in there and they had, all kinds of weapons of different kinds in there. We saw people walking around with backpacks on that had 3 and 4 baseball bats in them. Those people came to agitate and create violence, no question about it. But was this an attempt to overthrow the government by the group that was there, that crowd that was there? I absolutely do not believe it was.
Yeah, I don't believe for a moment.
I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't believe for a moment that the crowd was there with the idea of overthrowing the government. I do agree with you that I think an element of it was basically this kind of egging on. It's like your adrenaline is going, the door opens, you see a bunch of people running in, you run in behind them. But I also agree with you that another element was explicitly looking for chaos. And whether that's the guy with the zip ties or the pipe bombs or, the people who were making death threats against Cori Bush, or for that matter, talking about hanging Mike Pence, even Warnock, and many of these people were there at the location while they were going through the Capitol. I think there does need to be a deviation or disambiguation in the way that Shane says between the people who were there to cause violence and harm and mayhem versus the people who just kind of took it as, you're running with it as it goes. Now, and I also agree with you with the domestic terrorism thing that gets a little strained, but do you think there's a way to separate the two? I mean, because I do think there's a difference in between those things. I do think some people just took advantage of the moment. I do think, however, other people were more than taking advantage of the moment and was there explicitly to cause chaos. Are you okay with even them being called domestic terrorists, or is the idea that it is going to be a broad brush? And the moment that you go with this notion of one, then all of these other groups that may just be protesting is also going to be put on the chopping block when another Republican gets in office, or for that matter, another Trumpian type figure.
Right. So I think the problem with trying to parse, and I get exactly what you're saying, trying to parse, though, which individuals were there, because what you're having to do now is you're having to essentially look at a thought crime. And the reason for that is because how do you determine which group or individual broke windows? And once they got into the Capitol, which individual was attempting to look for Mike Pence, and which one was just walking through the building, which one was, making fun of Nancy Pelosi's office or wanted to steal the Speaker of the House podium, but at the Speaker's podium, but at the same time, which one wanted to actually cause physical, violence. So the problem is trying to parse those things. And so I think what there is no question about is that there was a riot at the Capitol. And there's no question there was mob violence at that Capitol. So there are plenty of laws on the books that currently criminalize those acts without having to go deeper and say we need a new layer of criminalization for what happened. And of course, I think one of the most frustrating parts of this is the double standard with which it's treated, because obviously and this is not a justification, it's just clarification. We went through 7 months of BLM riots in various cities to varying degrees. But what happened for, 40, 50 days nightly in Portland, Oregon, in Seattle, Washington, where we had, this autonomous zone that was set up, the CHOP autonomous zone, that essentially forced the police department to abandon the building and leave it behind? How is that not considered an insurrection or an act of domestic terrorism? But this is. And so, as a journalist, I think, and I'm sure you guys feel the same way, words mean something. And it's very difficult in our current moment where words have completely shifting meanings. And so it's hard to say, well, what is considered terrorism and what is not? And is it really based upon ideology and not on action? And I think that's where, when we get into the issue of the law requires, blind justice, meaning that it doesn't matter what your ideology is. What did you do? What was your intent? What are you trying to do? And then everyone gets an equal playing field. And we do not have that right now.
And I don't think we're going to have that. So, I mean, again, you can debate whether or not what was happening this last summer, whether that was domestic terrorism, what happened a couple of weeks ago, whether that was domestic terrorism. When you put them up against each other, I agree. Not everything is at parity. And the ways in which they aren't at parity, it would make me think that the former, what was happening earlier on, was a bit worse than the latter, what happened more recently. Having said that, what you didn't see last summer were people raiding political buildings, at least some of them with intent to kill. And we did see that, just a couple of weeks ago now. Now, while people died, no politicians did. So none of that came to pass. And again, I don't want to say the majority of folks in the crowd had that as their intent. I think, like the person that you were speaking to the day of said, there's just a mob mentality that kicks in where you are operating as a community, both physically and emotionally. You're being propelled by this group, and you kind of have no choice but to follow through with it. And thankfully, it's sad. Thankfully, less than a dozen people died. Thankfully, last count I saw was 5 people had died. That is way too many. Should have been 0. But thankfully, it wasn't dozens or hundreds, both with the people in the crowd and the potential response to it from Capitol Police. A couple of different ways we can go here. We've only got a couple of minutes. But let's turn to this. Why do you think the response from Capitol Police the day of was so milquetoast, Ben?
So that's a good question. I think there's a couple of things. One is that when the initial group was coming in, so the video of officers letting them come past the barricades and move up and kind of waving them through. My understanding of that, just from the feeling on the ground there, was that when these crowds were moving in, first of all, those Capitol Police could have done nothing. So if the crowd became agitated, you have a few dozen guys not wearing riot gear, just standing with these metal barriers. And there were thousands of people headed their way, thousands of people crossing over. But I also believe on those outer perimeters that the officers who were allowing them through didn't expect it to turn violent. They just thought these people were coming to protest.
Let's do that one then. We've only got a minute here before we need to go into a break, and we'll bring you back. But why do you think they weren't as well prepared? That's really what I meant. Why were there not nearly as many police as there should have been in advance of this catastrophe, Ben?
So being there, I don't think there was any indication whatsoever that these people would do anything other than chant and stand outside and wave their flags, because everyone's carrying around a flag, wave their flag and demand fairness. I don't think there was any notion or feeling that there was going to be an attempt to breach the building or damage the building or harm anyone.
Okay, let's come back on this. This is a very interesting conversation. We haven't even really gotten into the implications of this going forward, but we'll have to come back to that. We are joined by Ben Swann. He is a multi-award winning investigative journalist and chief executive officer of ICE Media Network, ICE Media Network, a free speech network dedicated to creating an uncensored, blockchain-based decentralized news and entertainment platform with a funding mechanism for independent media. We'll be back with Ben on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Ben Swann, multi-award-winning investigative journalist and chief executive officer of ISE Media Network, a free speech network dedicated to creating an uncensored, blockchain-based, decentralized news and entertainment platform with a funding mechanism for independent media. Ben, again, thank you for joining us. Do you think that this was an insurrection and that Trump should be impeached for it? Now, what I mean by this is, I don't mean an insurrection as this kind of specific legal, this gets into the whole thing of whether or not Trump basically should be impeached. Now, the first impeachment, I was entirely against. I think Shane was too, both of us were entirely against it. It just seemed they were looking for anything to impeach Trump on. And they found the most ridiculous thing in the world, considering that Biden was also implicated in his own scheme to basically do what Trump did in a similar fashion. So that one was weirder and stranger. But this one, to me, I have problems or qualms with a president that I think is acting in bad faith. And on top of that is basically stoking this idea in the public. And I got to be honest, it's one thing if there was a there where you could show it. But they weren't able to show it. In fact, they had multiple lawsuits that weren't able to show it. So from your standpoint, should Trump be impeached for, I guess, his role in stoking this? Or basically, it's like, well, no, he shouldn't be impeached. He's out of office. Let it pass. Which one?
Well, I think it's a couple things. First of all, I don't think, before should he be, I don't think he can be. I think there's a huge legal question here of whether or not the Senate has the ability to hold a trial for a president who was no longer president. The idea that you're going to use the impeachment process, and I know there's some debate among scholars about this, whether or not it can even be used is a little bizarre, because what it also opens the door to is it opens the door to any former president have been put on trial by the Senate after they're out of office. Well, that is a kind of a strange process. And the only reason that it seems to me that Congress is doing this, going forward with this process, is because they want to prevent him from running again, from holding office again in the future, which again seems like a bizarre act to me. Listen, if you truly believe that this president stoked violence and stoked his supporters to violence and led to chaos, why would you also believe that he was a threat to be reelected by supporters? Shouldn't he be losing favor with supporters, not gaining it? And I think that so that's first on that question. But secondly, should he be? I do not believe, again, having been there, that this president was the reason people went to the Capitol and began trying to storm into the Capitol. I do not believe that. What I do believe is that there are severe issues, a lack of trust. There is a trust deficit in media. So no matter what media says, they cannot be trusted. There's a trust deficit with tech companies. There's a trust deficit because of fact checkers who kick anyone off of social media who have a different belief system. I know these sound like little nitpicky things, but they're not. There's an erosion of faith in any institution, which leads people to violence, where people say there's no place for me to be heard and no one's listening to the concerns that we have. and no one will give us answers, and that's how these people felt, then you turn to a violent mentality. And so I think as a society, we have to be honest that it's not just one guy saying, hey, they're stealing the election that is causing the problem here. It is the fact that there are no institutions that people can lean into and say, is this true or not true? Because what they believe that all those institutions are collectively working against them. And we're not talking about a couple hundred people here. At the Capitol, we're talking about thousands, but nationwide, there are close to 80 million people who believe that. That is a significant number of people to just dismiss them and say, well, get over it, and we need to get rid of your quote-unquote leader, because that does not resolve any problem.
Well, the entire thing has been a missed opportunity. This I would argue, at the very latest, indications that this is what was really going on. Started back in 2015, 2016, when Trump started running, and specifically when he started talking about the fake news media. Now, every concern that people might have about the media's veracity in terms of what it's reporting, pretty much to a T, was dismissed because it was Trump who was complaining about it, because it was Trump who was talking about it in the political sphere. And there was an opportunity possibly for a time to repair the institutions of journalism, like you're talking about, to repair the systems that provide us with the information that we have to go on. That we completely missed that opportunity, and it seems like we've missed it, not just in that cycle, but in the one that we're still currently in. We haven't mentioned this yet. Twitter a couple of weeks ago banned Trump. Then very shortly after, Parler, the sort of alternative social media app, was taken down by Apple, Google from their app stores, and then of course by AWS, Amazon, from hosting in general. They're still offline as far as I can tell, as a functional service. I don't mean to use them too heavily, but they were the alternative for a lot of folks, specifically folks on the right, but just generally, or the main alternative to Twitter at the time. And this, as just in the last couple of days, Twitter has introduced a sort of new fact verification system, Birdwatch, I think it's called, where it's an attempt to do effectively the same thing that they've been trying to do for a while in a slightly different and more decentralized format, albeit not truly decentralized, where basically you go in and you fact check posts on Twitter, you fact check tweets, and you create some attempted dissent or whatever. I don't know how that's going to pan out. I don't think it'll pan out well though, but with Parler being banned, it seems like any alternative to the big tech platforms is going out the window, because it's not just them. It's really anything in the future. If you can pressure big tech companies, or if big tech companies of their own volition and out of self-interest have the ability to block alternatives to what they're providing, where do you go for information? It seems like we've missed that opportunity and we're cutting off any chance at a new one. But Ben, what's your take? Where do you think this is going?
Yeah, I think that's entirely the problem. And I think even deeper than that, we heard for years libertarians and conservatives saying, hey, these are private companies. If you don't like them, go build your own. And they would say it in a very tongue-in-cheek way. Well, someone like Parler, a company like Parler, does build their own. And then these tech companies circle the wagons to say, nope, you won't exist. And it's not just those companies. It's email service providers like MailChimp that have taken Tea Party groups and said, we don't agree with what you're saying. We're taking away your list and removing their email list. We've seen, IP service providers like GoDaddy saying we will no longer connect conservative sites to the internet. There's a war going on right now it's an information war between the public and big tech. And then when you have a Biden administration that within its first couple of days begins talking about an assistant attorney general who used to be a lawyer and work on behalf of Google and in order to fight antitrust laws, or brings in someone who helped with the Amazon Whole Foods merger and says this will be our attorney general over antitrust. I mean, this is why it creates continued erosion. We saw what happened with the New York Post story and Hunter Biden. And even Jack Dorsey admits that they handled that wrong to completely ban the sharing of this article about Hunter Biden. So, but the institutions have completely fallen apart. And because they've fallen apart, there are so many tens of millions of Americans who will say, I cannot believe anything they say. And by the way, listen, Trump began the fake news thing and was himself a person who rarely spoke the truth. I mean, if you're talking about just truth, the man does not speak, like, facts don't matter to him and truth doesn't matter. He just says whatever comes into his head and he claims that it's truth. But the problem is he came along at a time when the public can look at media and say, but they're doing the same thing. And so there is this idea that truth is entirely what you make it. And now you have the little guy, the working class party, because the other thing that Trump did was he brought in all these working class people to the Republican Party, and it became a working class party more so than it has probably ever been. But certainly in modern history, it is more of a working class party, and that is the group that is now part of this MAGA crowd who feel completely left out and disenfranchised by the so-called elite. And so we have this ideological war between both sides, information war between both sides. It leads us to a terrible moment in American history.
Yeah, agreed completely. And I mean, populism has for a long time been a sort of derogatory term for those who would follow demagogues. And I'm sad to say I've considered myself a populist in different forms, a sort of populist localist, something like that. It seems like Trump has just deepened the grave for those ideas. Because again, like you're saying, the working class ultimately, not the entirety, of course, but a lot of folks went in with Trump, and it seems to me like he has abandoned and betrayed them. We have a caller. We got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
Hey, what's going on, guys? I won't take up too much time. Really big fan of Ben Swann's work. Question to Ben. Have you... well, first, could you share a little information about the 5 people that it keeps coming up in the media that 5 people died or were murdered or killed, and it's just thrown out in a way, whereas it seems as if it was specifically related to the incident, like as if they died in combat there. Could you get into that a little bit as far as the actual causes of deaths and the actual deaths of those people, and also you mentioned earlier about a war between two sides, or a war between big tech and the public. I can't help but wonder, is it less a war and more an operation, in the way that with 9/11, a lot of those things they had already been carrying out as far as intrusions on our privacy, but the Patriot Act just kind of gave them the legal grounds later. That kind of like, rather do and then have to then ask, you know what I'm saying? So real quick, could you go into like those 5 people that died, and could you give some could you give your opinion on that, whether it's war or more sort of operation being carried out on the United States public?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. First of all, on the first one, I don't have information on all 5 people, but you're right. I mean, it's kind of just glossed over. Like a death is a death is a death. I believe one of the people, obviously the main woman who died was that Air Force veteran who was trying to push into the Capitol, and she was shot. And that was not, a rubber bullet. That was live ammo that hit her. The thing that's interesting about that, real quick, is that that's probably the first person shot by a police officer in at least a year that no one seems to care about, right? No one's saying, hey, why did police use deadly force? Why didn't they have riot gear there? Should this officer be charged, or Secret Service officer be charged, agent, because of the fact that she was shot? No, instead, she's a terrorist and she got what she deserved. That's a whole mantra that I thought we had moved away from over the course of the last year, but it's accepted there. There's a police officer who died, and there was another woman, I believe, who died. I think she had a reaction to being pepper sprayed, but I'm not sure about all of them. So I can't give you a lot of detail on that. But I do want to mention about what you said about the operation. I think you're right. It's less of a war and more of an operation in theory. The difference is this: when 9/11 happened and the Patriot Act came along, and yes, a lot of these things had already been lined up, the American public accepted it as absolutely this has to happen and there's no other way. There were so few people in this country who actually stood up against that and said, no, what they're doing is wrong. What they're doing is harmful. However, this time around, it's very different. And what we see happening is that it's not just the left, but the establishment, because establishment Republicans are doing the same thing, are saying we need a new Patriot Act, a domestic Patriot Act. And what I see is that the vast majority of people hearing this are saying, no, we don't. We do not need this, right? And in fact, I would say that the public has pretty much soured on the idea of the Patriot Act in general because it's led to a war on terror that's only bred more war and more terror. The war on terror has done nothing to end terrorism worldwide. It's just created chaos. And I think when you have that 20-year track record behind you, when somebody says, hey, we need a new Patriot Act specifically to domestic surveillance, you just don't have this overwhelming support from the public saying, yes, good idea. I don't hear anybody saying that it's a good idea.
I agree with you. There might be some. I haven't heard them. And, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if people who are pretty much, members of the public who buy into the MSNBC and CNN line about things. I wouldn't be surprised if there are plenty of folks out there who would be okay with that. But I'm worried that they're not aware of course, how that would come back to bite them if at some point, as is a certainty, their opposition comes into power and uses those same powers against them. We're out of time, though. Ben, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
For those listening, that was the voice of Ben Swann. He's a multi-award-winning investigative journalist, chief executive officer of ISE Media Network. It's a free speech network dedicated to creating an uncensored, blockchain-based, decentralized news and entertainment platform with a funding mechanism for independent media. You can follow Ben on Twitter at BenSwann_. That's Swann with 2 N's and an underscore after it. And you can check out his websites, truthinmedia.com and ise.media. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute taking calls, 202-521-1320. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking calls 202-521-1320. Very briefly, before we go to our callers, I want to throw this in here. This has to do with the question that Brave was asking when he called in the last segment. He was asking about details on the 5 deaths. Right now, here's the rundown that I have. You have Brian Sitnick, who is a Capitol police officer who was struck in the head with a fire extinguisher while he was engaging with the rioters. He collapsed soon after, rushed to a nearby hospital, and he died Thursday night, the next night. You have Ashley Babbitt, who Ben was talking about. She's the Air Force veteran, who a Trump supporter, who, when she was in the process of trying to get into the building, was shot with live fire. She died. She was shot in the neck. Ample live video of that going down. Pretty grim. You have Benjamin Phillips, a computer programmer who reportedly had a stroke and died. It's not confirmed at what point during the whole process, but yeah, had a stroke and died. You have Kevin Greason, who apparently died of a heart attack while this was going on. His family had said that he had high blood pressure, and that, if you're in the midst of a crowd like this, if this is all going on, that would certainly contribute to your blood pressure. And you have last Roseanne Boyland, who reportedly died of an unnamed medical emergency. So I don't know what exactly that is. Apparently she had a history of possession or distribution of heroin at least 4 times in her home state, Georgia. So that might have had something to do with it. I just don't know. With that out of the way, I just wanted to throw that in there because Brave, you'd asked about that. We're going to calls 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind, man?
I got 3 comments. The first comment is this: COINTELPRO. What you saw on January 6th of COINTELPRO, agent provocateurs that was in the crowd, the same agent provocateurs that was in the crowd, the BLM crowd that was mainly peaceful, that people show video of people throwing rocks, and you show video of people from the crowd chasing those people from the crowd and sometimes turning them into the police. The same type. They infiltrated both of the crowds just to cause mayhem and give the surveillance state more power. My second comment is we might have a chance to get the UFO files by August, September, October of this year, or maybe the end of this year. Things will be so bad in the country they might start declassifying certain things. They ain't going to declassify the John F. Kennedy assassination and COINTELPRO operation. They ain't going to do that. But when it comes down to UFOs, they might declass that because people going to be so angry because we don't have a jobs program, Medicare, we don't have our infrastructure program. So they might give that to us, hoping to calm us down, but they ain't going to do it. I'm just saying. But anyway, and my final comment is yesterday I emailed about Julian Assange to congressmen and senators because there's so many congressmen, there's so many ears and senators. I emailed them. I'm not worried about Joe Biden trying to get a partner for Julian Assange. Joe Biden ain't gonna do it. He's just one person. But you got 435 congressmen and 100 senators. So our chances is better emailing them so they can drop the charges and also reform the Espionage Act and other things, other laws, so it won't be easy to throw journalists and whistleblowers in jail for the rest of their lives. So, and also, but I found out yesterday, you can't email them some of them, you can't email them if you're in the district, if you're not in the district. So you have to call them. So I'm calling some of them today. So drop the charges, hashtag free Julian Assange. And also, just be in any further protests, everybody, be nonviolent. Don't play into these schemes. Don't just be careful what you say and just keep on moving forward. And love God. That's all I got to say.
Tarif, thank you for the call. Agreed. Yeah, I appreciate your work, and you're constantly pushing on this stuff. I kind of want to, just mainly because it's fresh in my mind, I kind of want to come back to the implications of this recent attack. And of course, that's going to be the establishment's response to it. Patriot Act 2.0, whether that's a specific bill or a wider set of responses from big tech, from Congress, from the Intel establishment, it's the only recent frame of reference I have that seems like it might apply would be what went on under the Soviet Union. Jamarl, what do you think?
You mean from the censorship that these guys are putting into place?
Yeah.
It's hard to. I mean, I don't think it's like the Soviet Union. No, I don't think it's there. I don't think we're airbrushing out people who we didn't particularly like. But I do think there's something problematic about the way this is going. I mean, and this is not just going to be right-wingers. It's also going to be left-wing sites. I mean, there was something on Facebook that recently was taken down. It was a left-wing site. And so it's like, this is not going to be one side. This is going to be somewhat of a broad brush. You remember when Trump took office in 2016, and there was this huge uproar over social media because they thought Democrats wouldn't make the argument that the election was stolen in the sense of the electoral system itself, meaning the people making votes. Their argument was that brains were hacked, and brains were hacked through social media. And so their argument and their attack were basically on social media itself. You guys are showing things and allowing perspectives that run contrary to the perspectives that we want people to know and we want people to think. And for the last, 50 years, we've been able to get away with people only having very narrow sources of information. And so the moment that devolves, the moment that you have this kind of breaking of credibility, this push for learning more and taking different positions and everything else, well, they panic. And their first thought is, we got to stop those people from trying to get more information, from trying to take these alternate perspectives. Some of the perspectives will, admittedly, be pretty grotesque, especially from the standpoint of a person, what they may think of issues of race, and even sometimes what you may think of issues of class. By the same token, these are people and these are points of view. And from the standpoint of our social media and everything else, social media looks at it and says, all right, we're going to acquiesce to the pressure that is being put on us. And to be honest, just in real terms, I don't think anybody that would run a social media site would want it to be a haven for people trying to injure or maim or kill. Getting rid of Parler and leaving Facebook is a little of a misfire, considering that Facebook was the thing where people were organized for the Capitol Hill attack. So I don't know. I don't think it's Soviet Union bad. I don't think it's one of those things where the organs of media have been entirely and completely taken by state interests. I do think these guys are stenographers. I do think these guys, but I don't think it's that bad, if that makes sense. I do think it's bad, and I do think it's going to get worse. I don't think we're going to see the end of this yet. I think this is going to continue to get worse, but not there.
I would say that in some ways it's better, but in a lot of ways it's worse. What you didn't have during the Soviet Union was real-time airbrushing. And what you did have last year was when people were trying to share in private messages, not in public messages, which would still be allowed, but in their private messages, when they were trying to share the New York Post story on Hunter Biden and the emails, everything that was getting released, the photos, videos, all that stuff, it was being censored in real time. That is something the Soviet Union wasn't capable of. And I don't mean to, make a boogeyman out of them, but just using that as a frame of reference, in a lot of ways, I would say it's already worse. And I would say we're still fairly early in the process of the degradation of our public space. I don't think we're halfway through it yet. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the scary part is being able to hit a button and just eliminate the person's ability to communicate. That's terrifying. I mean, we build up these structures.
And we're there.
We're there.
We're there.
And by the way, as a software engineer, you can block an account. You can block access to various elements of that account. If you're talking about Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, all of these other devices, those things can basically be shut off where your ability to interact with the system is taken. And that's not a choice as a group. That's something that the company has as individuals. The tweet thing is terrifying. That's so dystopian that basically you're going to have a mass perspective that determines what's true. And that determination of truth, they're putting it there for a reason. It's not just going to be there in the background for no reason. It's going to be there for the sake of making choices about what to show versus not, or what to put on saying this is false versus not. That stuff is dystopian, man. Isn't it weird how despite different, let's say, economic systems or political systems, the mechanisms of control basically end up being somewhat similar? The idea of censorship, the idea of repression, the idea of, if this country is at war, we probably get food cards and rationing. And even now with the COVID-19, you have Amazon, private company, rationing supplies, even at the drug companies. Like, it's just very strange the way it seems like the mechanisms of control are the mechanisms of control regardless of the country that you have, regardless of the structure. So, yeah, I do think it's bad, and I do think it has the potential to get extremely dystopian. Are we there yet? I don't think we're there yet. I think it get worse, and that's unfortunate.
Well, how I set this up was the response, and the response is still not over. We're still in midstream in this thing. And when I compared us to the Soviet Union, it was really looking forward to the future. But again, in some ways, I would say we're already there. I would say, I don't want to misquote you, but I think you were saying you don't see the informational establishment as having been completely bought out by the national security interests of the state. I would say they are. I would say it's over, man. To a rounding error, we're already at that point. You called it weird that it works the same way in different times in different places. I think it's natural. If you want to control people, it's not the most effective thing is not to control their bodies, is try to control their minds. And I don't mean mind control in any sort of weird, esoteric or physical sense. I'm not talking about drugs. I'm talking about what people think.
Yeah.
What access to what information they have access to, what they're allowed to say, what they're allowed to communicate, and therefore, in a very real sense, what they are able to think, what kinds of thoughts you are going to have, what kinds of responses you're going to have to certain sets of events. What emotional tenor you're going to take when you see certain things happen. I'm speaking in abstractions here, but the most effective way to control somebody is to influence the way they think, to influence what they're able to think. And so it makes sense that that's how it would work in different times and places. And for a long time, not going to name names, some people who have been very worried about the degradation of this stuff in the long run, about where we're going as a country, from every different political quarter. And a lot of what they're saying is coming to pass. That's my take. We need to close it out.
Yeah.
We're pretty much there, yeah. So I'll close out today's show. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. Thank you to all of our guests. Great conversations this morning. It's great to have John Kiriakou back on the station. Thank you to you for calling in. Thank you, Brave, Kevin from Canada, our other callers. Thank you to Reef. Thank you to producers Cameron and Raheem. Thank you, engineer Andre. And thank you, Jamarl Thomas, for co-hosting the show with me. It's been a pleasure. It will continue to be a pleasure. And thank you, that is you, for listening to this show. Hope you folks have a great day. We'll be back tomorrow morning, signing off Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
That is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Guys, you're going to see me probably within the next maybe 20 or 30 minutes. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. And yeah, I am happy that Kiriakou is back. Kiriakou, I've always liked Kiriakou. Fascinating guy, especially when you get the opportunity to talk to him. So I'm glad he's back on the show. I'm glad he's having these conversations. And the behind the scenes stuff is always fascinating. The buying parts is amazing. All right, guys, I'm going to say like, share, subscribe, and I will see